Hey guys, in this video I want to talk to you about deaf culture as well as 4 signs you'll learn for deaf, hard of hearing, deaf and hard of hearing, DHH, and hearing impaired. So in general, you will never use hearing impaired because it is a term that focuses on the lack of hearing and frames it negatively, whereas deaf focuses on a cultural and linguistic, a social, that entire culture, all of those wonderful things about deafness. Then there's also hard of hearing. Some people choose to identify themselves that way as I'm hard of hearing, so identifying a bit more with like the mainstream culture, the hearing culture, versus deaf can be more of a identification with the deaf culture. And then you have DHH, which is deaf and hard of hearing, which kind of encompasses just everyone in general. So to start with the signs, deaf. So this is a number 1 hand shape, not a D. It's going to be a number 1, kind of like an S, but with your index finger up. Deaf, or it can be deaf. Then we have hard of hearing. So it's toward the middle of your body to the outside, just like if you were like finger spelling across. So hard of hearing or hard of hearing. Okay. Hard of hearing or hard of hearing. Deaf or deaf. Okay. Then we have DHH. DHH. Okay. Then we have HI, hearing impaired, which you're not going to use. So in general, if you look at it from an auditory standpoint, if you were an audiologist and you were looking at someone's audiogram, you could look at them and say, oh, they are profoundly deaf, they are this level of hearing, maybe they just have a mild hearing loss, so they're more hard of hearing, so you can classify them that way. But also deaf people tend to use this as their identification. So someone who is technically hard of hearing with their audiology, like that whole discussion, they could identify themselves and say, I am deaf. That is who I choose to be. And so I have a lot of friends who will do that. Maybe they have a lot of hearing and they would be able to speak very well. They would be able to hear very well, but their identification is with deaf culture is mine. Like that's my language. That's my love. That's my whole group. That is my life. I live in the deaf world. That is what I love. And then I have the other people who, even if they had a like huge hearing loss, they are profoundly deaf, they would identify more with being hard of hearing because maybe they grew up signing more English or being more oral rather than signing. So lots of different things, and they would choose to identify, even though they have a more degree of hearing loss or not, then they might choose to identify and say, oh, I am hard of hearing. And then you also have people who would choose to say that I am hearing impaired, which negatively frames it and focuses on the lack. So generally that's not an appropriate term to label someone and say, oh, the hearing impaired. Usually people try and grab that as like the nice term, so we think we'll call them hearing impaired, but they choose to be called deaf. So you want to identify them as deaf people. And so some people though will choose to use hearing impaired. So that's why I'm throwing that one out there as well. So deaf, hard of hearing, DHH, deaf and hard of hearing, and hearing impaired.